and it's a happy Lag BaOmer. I mean, maybe people are still getting over the smoke. I don't know. But it's good to see everyone and freshly shaven and getting ready for Matan Torah. So with that in mind, I wanted today to talk about a relatively recent development in Shavuot, which has become, I think, pretty universal. We'll talk about it. This year is slightly different because this year Shavuot falls on Motzei Shabbat. But actually there is a tie-in which we'll reach at the end of this year to the fact that Shavuot is on Motzei Shabbat. The Minhag that I'm referring to, and I will share the screen now, the Daf Makorah, is the question of I'll make it a little bit bigger for everyone. The question of when does Shavuot start? That's generally speaking, we're going to talk about the general principle as well. As we all know, usually we accept Shabbat, we accept Chag a little bit early, 18 minutes, half an hour, 40 minutes in Yerushalayim, different minhagim as to when we light candles, when Shabbat begins. There's a din, which I'm not going to really focus on per se. Next talk, maybe another shir, I'll do that, to talk about the nature of what's called Tosefet Shabbat or Tosefet Chag. Is it a D'oraita concept? Is it a D'Rabbanan concept? Is it something which sometimes is D'oraita, sometimes is D'Rabbanan? This is a machloket in the Rishonim, but that is normally what we do, and more than that, and we'll take a look at perhaps the source for that as well. There is a notion that which we're all familiar with at this time of the year, that we have in what we call an early Shabbat or an early Chag, especially in those areas of the world which are further north than we are, and when the sun sets very late in the evening during the summer. So then there is a real need to make Shabbat earlier so that people can have their meals at a somewhat normal hour. Here in Israel, it's perhaps a little bit less pressing. The early minyanim are not quite as popular as they are in other areas of the world. But at the same time, certainly people with young children are usually the ones who are most interested in making an earlier Shabbat, but not only. And we know that this is something that happens. And yet, now we'll talk about the peculiarity of Shavuot. When it comes to Shavuot, so we have a notion, the Minhag has become that we do not accept Shavuot earlier. We accept Shavuot at the beginning of Shavuot, and we have the Tefillah at Tzeda Kochavim, and the meal certainly after Tzeda Kochavim, after the stars have come out, and it is night time in its entirety, and not a question of simply of it being that we've decided to make it Chag. And the question is, why does that is that the halacha? Why do we have a notion that that Shavuot should be different? And so here, let's just look at a little bit of a background, and then where this begins and what different people's reaction to it. What I found very interesting about this question, because you might think it's and maybe it is a relatively, I wouldn't say minor, but it's not a central concept in terms of the Chag or of what's going on, and yet it has become not only a universal custom. I'm not really familiar with any community at this point that doesn't do it, but also perhaps even more importantly, becomes a focus of a major discussion about the very nature of Yom Tov. and certainly the nature of what it means to accept Yom Tov and Shabbat earlier, and what we're doing when we are able to do it. So there are two elements to this particular minhag which I'd like to explore with you today. One of them is perhaps call it the sociology, the way that a minhag spreads, some of the pushback against the minhag. That's on the one hand, and on the other hand, to be focusing on what is the underpinning from a Lomdus perspective, and to be looking at it in pure in a pure sugya type of way, in an analytic type of way. If you would say the minhag is what's going on the street, as it were, what's going on outside, and how things are developing within the community. And the Lomdus is, well, what's going on in the Bet Midrash? How are the Chachamim, how are the different Rabbanim understanding this din and applying it as such? And I think that there's a parallel here, and it's really very, at least I found it very, very interesting. So let's take a look with that short introduction in mind. Let's take a look at some of the underpinnings. So if we take a look at the first source, this is the psukim that we read in Shul just a few weeks ago, and we read it earlier on the second day of Pesach. This is what's known as the Parshat HaMoadim, where the Torah lays out all of the different chagim, including Rosh Hashanah, including Yom Kippur, and as part of that, the Torah speaks to us with regard to Chag Shavuot, and the Torah tells us that Shavuot is preceded by the time of the year that we're in now. So Usfartem pasuk Tedvav, Usfartem lachem imocharat Shabbat miyom haviachem et omer atzufa sheva Shabbatot timimot tiyana. So you shall count from the day after the Shabbat. This is, of course, a source in of itself of a major dispute during the time of Bayit Sheni as to, and perhaps even earlier, we don't know, but as to when do we begin the Sfirat HaOmer? Do we begin Sfirat HaOmer the way that we do? That we don't read Shabbat in its simplest way of looking at it, but rather Shabbat meaning the first day of Pesach. Or does Shabbat itself refer to the Shabbat that is inside of Pesach, and therefore Shavuot will always fall out the way that it does this year on a Sunday? As it worked out this year, there would have been no machloket at all with regard to the question between the Tzdukim, between the Sadducees and the Prushim, the Pharisees, as to the Chachamim, as to when Shavuot would start. Everyone would agree this year that since the first day of Pesach was on Shabbat, so the Shavuot would be on Sunday. But in any event, from the day which you bring the Korban HaOmer, the Omer, the sheath, the sheath offering, which was waved, it was comprised of barley, the first barley that of the year that was harvested on that night, the second night of Pesach. Sheva Shabbatot Timimot Tiyena ad mimocharat Shabbat Hashvi'it. So till the following seventh day after the Shabbat, Tisperu Chamishim Yom. You should have counted 50 days. Of course, 50 as opposed to Shabbatot, Timimot, 49. There are different ways to square that circle. Is it 49 days? Is it 50 days? We'll just take the way that Rashi says it, that basically after having counted 49 days, meaning after having counted 7 weeks, you reach the 50th day. V'hi kraftem mincha chadasha l'Hashem. And at that point, on the 50th day, you will bring a new korban mincha, a new grain offering to God. And then from Psukim, Yud Zayin through Chaf, there's a description of what we know as the korban shtei halechem, the korban of bringing 2 loaves of bread along with different animals that were brought as part of that korban. So those details are from Pasuk Yud Zayin through Pasuk Chaf, which I have skipped here. Pasuk Chaf Aleph, Ukratem be'etzem hayom hazeh. and you shall call out on this particular day. Mikra Kodesh Yeh Lachem. It will be a day of the declaration of Kedusha. Kol melechet avodah lo ta'asu. Do not engage in any work. Chukat olam b'chol shvotechem dorotechem. And you shall in all of your settlements you shall, for all generations, this is the law. Okay, so on the pasuk, and we're going to come back. We'll mention perhaps this idea of kratem be'etzem hayom hazeh, that you should call out on this and this very day. What does it mean be'etzem? Why does it have to say be'etzem? Perhaps we'll have an opportunity to come back to that. But on this day, this is the day of Shavuot. So now with that in mind, we have Rashi on the pasuk of Tmimot Tihiyena, that you should have Sheva Shabbatot Tmimot Tihiyena, that first bit right there at the beginning of the very first part of the pasuk, that we have that it's supposed to be Timimot, they're supposed to be whole. What does that mean? So Rashi, number 2, explains Melamed Shematchil Umoneh Mi Ba'erev. This teaches us that the halakha that we're familiar with, that we need to count from the evening, not as to talk about Lag BaOmer. So we wouldn't call it today, but rather we would start the count last night. She'im loken, if you didn't count from the beginning of the day, meaning from the evening preceding the day, so then they would not be tmimot. They would not be complete. That you need to count at the beginning, and this without perhaps for another shir we'll get into that. But the idea that if a person doesn't count at night and counts on the day, so this is the source for the idea of not counting with the bracha if you do not count from the night. Now, you could argue, well, just as an aside, of course, everything here, why should this be any different than any other holiday? After all, every holiday starts at night. So the idea that the count needs to be tmimot, I could have understood even without the word tmimot, that it is I should be counting at night, because that's when the day starts. It's sort of like saying, well, you're supposed to be eating in the sukkah on Sukkot. So the first day of Sukkot, so you should be even the night you should be sitting in the sukkah. And we don't have any special pasuk to teach me that. Why do I need a special limud here of tmimot to tell me that? Presumably, I would say from a pshat perspective, the focusing on the part of these psukim that I sort of skipped, namely the korban aspect. Here, the Torah is linking Shavuot, and this is something which is important on multiple levels. I'm just going to talk about it on one level right now. I can look at Shavuot from the perspective of the 2 korbanot that serve as its brackets. We have, on the one hand, on the second day of Pesach, the Korban HaOmer, when that first grain was brought, and then on Shavuot proper, we have the Shtei HaLechem. So these 2 grain offerings are very apropos for this time of year, because barley is which ripens more quickly than the wheat. The barley is harvested in the early spring, and that's the Korban HaOmer. That also, and this is part of the psukim that I skipped, didn't bring here. That leads me to the heter of eating the new grain. Until then, there's a isur of chadash, and then I have the Shtei HaLechem, which is the first wheat offering in the Beit HaMikdash. So we have this kind of bracket between what was brought on the second day and what's being Pesach and what's being brought on the day of Shavuot itself. Now, the moment that I introduce the korbanot into the picture, and I'm basically saying that Shavuot is a function of these two korbanot. Shavuot, after all, is the only day, the only Yom Tov without a date. The Gemara says that we know it always as Vav Sivan, but it doesn't have to be that way. It depends on how long the month of Nisan was. Was Nisan a 29-day month? Or was Nisan a 30-day month? Was ER a 29-day month? Was ER a 30-day month? In our calendar, Nisan is always 30 days. ER is always 29 days. So therefore, Shavuot will always be on the 6th. But Shavuot is determined, according to the Torah, by the count of 50 days, not by the calendar date. So if you had a 29-day Nisan and a 29-day ER, so then, as it could have happened during the time of the Beit HaMikdash when they were working with the witnesses, so then the date for Shavuot could have been the 5th of Sivan, If both months were Malay, both were 30 days, so then it would be Zayin. If it was one was Malay and one was Chaser, the way that our calendar works out, so then it would be Vav. So the Shavuot is determined by the count, and the count is determined by the korbanot. And the korbanot in the Beit HaMikdash are always brought in the day. The Beit HaMikdash the Beit HaMikdash day does not work the way that our calendar dates work. In the Beit HaMikdash, all korbanot, all avodah is done during the day. Nothing is done at night. And the following evening is when you are eating or you are partaking of the korbanot that were brought the previous day. So the Beit HaMikdash day is day and night, not night and day, the way our calendar dates work. So I could have thought that for Shavuot, which is so determined by what was going on in the Beit HaMikdash, that the count is a daytime count. So the Torah tells us Tmimot, Sheva Shabbatot Tmimot, it has to be the full calendar day count, starting from the night and including the day, and not the other way around. Okay, so that, if you will, from a Pshuto Shel Mikra type of way of understanding what's going on, the Torah has introduced us to this notion of Sfirat HaOmer. It has told us that this has to be Tmimot. Rashi, in the footsteps of Chazal, explained that the notion of Tmimot is referring to the count of each individual day, which is a little bit off of Sheva Shabbatot Tmimot, right? The original wording of the pasuk that we started with, namely that the 7 weeks are weeks that are that are whole, and that's where we stand. Now, fast forward to the 16th century, and the Shnei Luchot Habrit, known as the Shla, the Sefer, very influential Sefer that was written by Rabbi Shaya Levi Horovitz, who was, and we'll come back to where he came from. He came from Galicia, from southern Poland, and spent most of his formative years in Krakow and in that area. And then he, later on in his life, so he migrated to Eretz Yisrael, where he's buried. But the point, though, here is that he introduces us, or there might be earlier sources that I'm unfamiliar with, but to the best of my knowledge, is the first written record of the following minhag. Source number 3: Chag Shavuot hu asher tziva Hashem yitbarach la'asot chag achar shiva Shavuot shel hasfira. So in his description of Chag Shavuot, straightforward, this is the holiday after 7 weeks of counting. V'kibalti mimori hagaon Rav Shlomo milublin. So I received as a misorah from Rav Shlomo milublin, shekibel mipi ish eid mipi hagon Rav Yaakov Palak zal. So this misorah, this tradition goes back to Rav Yaakov Palak. Rav Yaakov Palak was known as basically the dean of Polish Rabbanim. even though there was Jewish settlement in Poland, probably dating back to the 12th or maybe even the 11th century, but Poland becomes a major Torah center only in the 16th century, but that begins in the 15th century. And Rav Yaakov Pollack is really considered to be the person who is beginning this, who is as I said, the dean of Polish Rabbanim. So basically what the Shla is saying, that this is a Mesorah that goes back to the earliest days, if you will, in Poland. Shelo la'asot kiddush, not to make the kiddush, v'le'echol b'leil rishon shel Chag Shavuot ad Tzedek Kochavim. So the Mesorah here is not to have kiddush, right? The emphasis is on kiddush, and to eat the meal before Tzedek Kochavim on Shavuot. Where is this minhag from? V'hatam mipnei shebesfira ktiv sheva shabbatot timimot tihiyena. So since the pasuk says that you should have 7 full weeks, the imken keshemekadesh mi ba'od yom mechaser oto hamiktzat mi 49 yemei hasfira. So if you were to begin your Shavuot earlier, before Tzeit HaKochavim, before the stars had come out, before it was actual nightfall, so then you would have had, in effect, had cut away a little bit from the full 49 days. You wouldn't have Sheva Shabbatot Tmimot, you wouldn't have 7 full weeks. Sharei Chag Shavuot hu la'achar Sfira. Chag Shavuot is the 50th day, and it shouldn't creep into the 49 days. V'nimtza she'enan tmimot, and they would not be whole. So then he's aware of, after all, he just said that you shouldn't make kiddush and you shouldn't eat. But what about tefillah? Al teshiveni mima shemitpalelin az hatefillah mi ba'od yom. In other words, if I come home and I make my kiddush and it's Tzeit HaKochavim, and it took me 5 minutes to walk from the shul, and it took a few minutes to set up the table. That means that when did I pray Arvit? So my Arvit was actually in the Ben HaShmashot period. There are people, for different reasons entirely, and much older reasons, the idea that on the first night of Pesach, so we started Tzeit HaKochavim, because the Torah tells us that you're supposed to only make the Chazal understood you should only have the Kiddush when you have the Matzot Umrorim and the Pesach, ideally, in front of you, and that has to be eaten at night. The Torah says that you should eat the Pesach at night, so the Seder can't start before Tzedek Kochavim. There's no problem to have a so-called early minyan for Pesach, and to have Arvit earlier, and to be at home and to start your Seder exactly at Tzedek Kochavim. There's no problem with that at all. So this is the same type of thing, apparently, that's going on in Galicia. And so he's saying, one second, if the whole issue is to be mod, that I'm supposed to have a full count, so how could I be davening Ma'ariv earlier? Al teshiveni mima shemitpalelin az hatefillah mi ba'od yom. Dezeh eino klum. That's not a problem, because based on a Gemara in Brachot, and I didn't bring the Gemara in Brachot to make the sheet not too unwieldy. But basically, this is the source of the idea that we can make an early Shabbat, and that Rav Yoshia and other Amoraim, not only did he do what we do, namely that he prayed on Erev Shabbat and brought Shabbat in early, he actually, this can be done as well, he prayed the Arvit of Motzei Shabbat when it was still Shabbat afternoon. It was after the time of what we call Plag HaMincha, so towards the end of the day, without getting into the details right now. But basically, towards the end of the day, an hour and a quarter before the end of Shabbat, he would pray Arvit. Now, Shabbat itself obviously doesn't end just because you pray Arvit. And here is an anomaly. On the one hand, if you pray Arvit on Friday afternoon, so then you could say that it's now Shabbat. But if you pray Arvit late on Shabbat afternoon, we don't say, okay, now it's Motzei Shabbat, and you can make Havdalah and go into the and go to the movies. But rather, this is you're allowed, and this is was done because people did not want to be out late at night when it was dark, if they could avoid it. So you could have an earlier Arvit, even though it's still Shabbat. Now, if that's the case, so then he says, so basically I'm doing the same thing over here. When I pray my Arvit on Shavuot, it's still the 49th day of the Omer, even though I'm praying Arvit right now. My Shavuot will begin when I make Kiddush. When I make Kiddush, that's already Tzedek Kochavim. So I have this idea of this complete 7-week count. Now, if we move a little forward in the halacha, in the minhag, and the development of the minhag, in the very same area, but we're talking now, as you can see, and that's why I brought the dates here. The Taz of David Halevi, who is a generation and a half after the one generation, we'll say, is one generation after the Shla. The Shla is a contemporary of the Taz's father-in-law, Rabbi Circus the Bach, but they're in the same area, and there's I don't know, I didn't look into this to see if they had what kind of dealings they had one with the other, but presumably their paths crossed. And the Taz, in his commentary to Orach Chaim, and Siman Tav Tzadi Daled is the Siman where the Shulchan Aruch discusses the halachot of a Shavuot. This idea of starting Shavuot at the Tzedek Kochavim never comes up in the Shulchan Aruch. It's a Polish minhag, which, as I said, may have developed in the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century. That's what the Shla says where it begins, or at least that's the first edut of it. Perhaps it's an even earlier Polish minhag. But here now, a generation after the Shla, the Taz writes the following: Ma'achrin lahatchil arvit b'knisat Shavuot kedei shiyu yemei hasfirat tmimot. One line, we delay the beginning of Arvit at the beginning of Shavuot in order that the full count should be complete. Right. So here already we are no longer talking about just making Kiddush at Tzedek Kochavim. It's now developed the way that this is the common minhag today, that we will not begin Arvit until Tzedek Kochavim. Two generations, after the Taz, the Pri Megadim, Rav Yosef Ta'omim, who is the primary super commentator on the Taz. He wrote a commentary on the Taz. He wrote a commentary on the Magen Avram as well. The Pri Megadim writes, Umikol Makom, he's also in Poland, by the way, same area. Mikol Makom Yireh, the Gam Be'arvit Mamtinin Kibosha Katav Zal. The Tataz. He picks up on the fact that the Taz had said Arvit, and he didn't say Kiddush, even though that seems to have been the original minhag. The minhag is now morphed a little bit, and now we're saying Arvit after Tzedek Kochavim, and he gives an explanation for why. Why? Dahab avelut v'nida yesh omrim im hitpalelu hakahal arvit shekvar asau l'layla. Im kein habainan tmimot mem tet yom ukshmitpalel arvit umaskir b'tfila yom hashavuot mibod yom harei chaser mimem tet yom. So he says, even though the Shla, he doesn't reference the Shla directly, but even though the Shla had said, I can daven the tefillah of Motzei Shabbat on Shabbat. But here, when I say the Mikadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim, when I say Yom HaShavuot, Chag Matan, Zman Matan Toratenu, when I'm saying that in my Shemona Esrei, I am in effect accepting the Chag upon myself. And it's no longer, I can't say that it's, on the one hand, it's the count leading up to Shavuot, and it's Shavuot at the same time. Those two things just don't work together. And he brings us a reference, and this notion, Daha ba'avelut v'nida yesh omrim im hitpalalu akal arvit shekvar asau laila. What is that referring to? That if, with regard to avelut and with regard to nida. So let's take a look here, going down a little bit, and we see the following halacha. So here's the what he's referencing it. So here is the source with regard to this is the Truma Tadeshin source number 13. This is a much earlier source from the 14th century in Germany, and here is the question. Had tepaskinan yom sheposeket bo ena ola lesfirat shiva nekiim uvainan shiva shleimim sheinam chaserim afilu mashim. So before, when you count the 7 nikiim days, when a woman counts those 7 days after she's no longer, as she's finished with her cycle, im kvar hitchilu hakahal hitpalel arvit va'od hayom gadol yechola lahavsik ba'ota sha'a v'lo amrinan ho'il va'asu hakahal liyom hazeh laila li'inyan arvit yechashev nami kiyom shel macharat v'lo to'il la'asfira b'yom hazeh. So here is here's the question. And the question is very simple. The community, or the woman herself for that matter, if it's a, whoops, excuse me, hold on. Getting back to this. So we have a situation where a woman has now not done what we call the hefsek tahara. She hasn't made sure that her flow is actually stopped in order to start her Shiva Nikiyim. And the Shiva Nikiyim begin with with Shabbat. The Tzibur made an early Shabbat. And in the time of this is no longer the case because of the nature of our communities. But in theory, it should apply to us as well today. Rav Moshe actually has a tshuva with regard to bungalow colonies as to whether this would apply in those circumstances. But if the entire community were to decide that they're going to make an early Shabbat, or for that matter, if this particular woman, in the way that we would look at it, has already lit the Shabbat candles and has accepted Shabbat, and it's now 20 minutes or so before the sun has set, and she realizes that she didn't do a hefsek tahara. So is she able to do a hefsek tahara, yes or no? That's the question. And we're going to come back to his answer, but I'll just take a look at the bottom line in terms of because this is what the Pri Megadim is referring to. When the Rama brings this halacha and he says yesh omrim ihipalalu akal arvit, and that's what's so important. She didn't light candles necessarily, but the tzibur has accepted Shabbat by praying arvit. Va'od hayom gadol eina yechola livdok ol lilvosh liblanim ulatchil linot miyom hamacharat mi'achar da'akal kvar asu ato laila. So the first opinion, which is the actual psak of the Truma Tadeshin, is that it's too late to begin. It is now Shabbat. It is no longer Friday. So basically, she has to push off her Shiva Nikiyim for another day. She can't start until Motzei Shabbat, because it's now Shabbat. The sun is still shining, but it doesn't matter. Shabbat has begun. And the other opinion, Yesh Omrim Demutar Afilu Asa Kal Shabbat. There are those who say no, it's still not considered to be for her the beginning of Shabbat, and in terms of the date, the count for her is based on the actual sun setting. So ein lachush, excuse me. So the Minhag, the Rama says, and here this is I'm not going to get into the halachot here in terms of nida, but the Rama's psak at least is that we try to tell people, do your hefsek tahara, start the Shiva Nekiyim before the tzibur has prayed Arvit, but if it occurred, so then we'll rely on the second shita and allow her to start the Shiva Nekiyim the following night. Similar question comes up with Avelut. We'll see a particular instance. You know what? Let's go back in terms of Avelut. Same type of question. The question is the following. Source number 11. So this is a snippet from a tshuva of the Netziv of Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, and it's a later tshuva because it's the end of the 19th century. But here is the question. Al devar hashela isha shedlika neirot b'Shabbat Kodesh shechal b'Yom Tov. So this particular woman lit the Shabbat candles, and which was it was Shabbat and it was Yom Tov together. V'noda la avelut v'nahaga avelut b'sha kala zo ad shechashecha. So she lit the candles, and it's now about 20 minutes before Knisat Shabbat and Knisat Chag. She didn't even make an early Shabbat, or she could have. It doesn't really matter whether it's an early Shabbat Yom Tov or it's 20 minutes before. It's still, the sun hasn't set. That's what's most important for us. And there's a knock on the door. And a telegram comes. And the telegram bears terrible news that one of her relatives has passed away and that the burial took place on that Friday. This is, of course, before there were telephones, but their telegrams were available. So she receives the word of her avelut in this period of time between the time she lit the candles and after and before Shabbat and Yom Tov had actually begun. And this actually occurred. And she quickly took off her shoes, sat on the floor, began Avelut. The question is, does that count as beginning Avelut? Or is it already considered to be Yom Tov? Because if it's already considered to be Yom Tov, because she lit the candles, so the halacha is that if God forbid a person passes away and the burial takes place on Chag, so then, or if for that matter, if a person finds out about a pre-existing death before on Yom Tov, so then you begin the Shiva only afterwards, only after the let's say if it was Pesach, the week of Pesach is over. Because on the other hand, just get to the other hand, and then I'll explain the concept. If a person begins their avelut before the Chag, so the Chag, as opposed to Shabbat, breaks the avelut, and Shiva is over. So the reason for both of these concepts is the idea that there is a conflict between the not only the kedusha but the simcha of Yom Tov, what's known as the simcha of the Rabbim, the simcha of the community, and the avelut of the yachid. So the simcha of the Rabbim cancels and aborts the avelut of the individual, and that's why if a person had begun Shiva before the Chag, so the Chag cancels the Shiva, and so even if she had only sat for a few moments, so then her Shiva would be over. But on the other hand, for the very same reason, the simcha of the Yom Tov doesn't let the avelut even begin if the avelut were to begin on the Chag. So that's why if a Shiva period were to begin on the Chag, so we say that because of that, you have to wait with your Shiva until after the Chag. So now the question began, well, my husband was still running around in the house, doing the last minute malachot before Shabbat. I happened to have lit the candles and said, Mikadesh Shabbat, Mikadesh Shabbat Yisrael v'Hazmanim. But it's sort of this hybrid time when things are going on in the house. I've accepted Shabbat and Yom Tov as well. So I sat down, she sits down, and she begins her Shiva. Does that Shiva count? Yes or no? So here, the assumption, going back to our original source here of the Pri Megadim, the assumption is that no, under these circumstances, so we have to take a look at it as saying once the tzibur, this is not exactly the case that the Nitziv is talking about where there was candle lighting, but rather the tzibur has accepted Shabbat, the tzibur has accepted Yom Tov. So then if a person were to find out after that about a pre-existing avelut, so the avelut would only begin after the Chag. So the Pri Megadim says, you see that Arvit of the Tzibur is the defining moment, and if Arvit of the Tzibur is the defining moment for Avelut, and if Arvit of the Tzibur is the defining moment for Nida, so then Arvit of the Tzibur should be the defining moment for the definition of this Tmimut. And so we're now in the 18th century, and we have this halacha, minhag, which had started with people not making the kiddush of Shavuot on the kiddush of Shavuot until after Tzeit HaKochavim. It is now changed into them not davening Arvit, and now beyond that, it's also being linked to other halachot. What began as a minhag is now being deeply linked into halachot of nida, halachot of Avelut, to explain why we shouldn't have Arvit until after the Tzedek Kochavim. Once we're on the notion of minhagim and how they're developing, if we fast forward to the 21st century, really referencing earlier sources, but a recent work, a very important work, which has come out called the Piskei Tshuvot, which is a expansion on the different an explanation of different later commentaries. So he brings the notion that not only is the minhag not to have the tefillah until after Tzedek Kochavim, nashim. So here we have, and what about women? Af al pi she'enan chayavot b'mitzvat sfirat ha'omer. That is a discussion in of itself. Are women obligated in mitzvah of Sfirat HaOmer, yes or no? So we'll leave that also for another time. However, mikol k'makom, gam hein tzrichot lihamtin v'lo lekadesh v'lechol atzeit kochavim. So they should also wait, even though you could say they don't have the issue of the Sheva Shavatot Tzvimot, because they don't have a chiyuv to be counting the sfira. Nevertheless, they should also wait until Tzeit HaKochavim. And the idea also, if they should be waiting, and he doesn't mention candle lighting per se, but so in this snippet I took the wrong paragraph where that also minhag for many women is to wait till Tzeit HaKochavim to light the candles for Shavuot, when Shavuot doesn't fall out on Shabbat itself. But the idea that the Tzeit HaKochavim should be that you should be lighting the candles also after Tzeit HaKochavim. Today, this year, it won't be an issue at all, since since it falls out on Motzei Shabbat, and you can only light the candles after Tzeit HaKochavim because of the Melacha. But the idea here is that you just see the expansion of this particular minhag that began with not saying kiddush, goes on to question of arvit, and now, according to some opinions, includes the issue of lighting candles as well. Now, there's a pushback. Right? As I said, it's becoming a universal minhag, but the universal minhag had two streams, if you will, of pushback. One was from the ancestors of Polish Jewry, and that's German Jewry. So the contemporaries of these poskim who we've been quoting until now, but the ones who are in Germany, so they say the following. So in the Siddur of Rav Yaakov Emden, so Rav Yaakov Emden who says the following: Yesh shema acharin lehitpalel ad shechashecha. So there are those who wait to daven late. V'hu dikduk chalush mechudash be'achronim. So he says the whole concept is a very weak and questionable dikduk that the achronim, the later scholars, have come up with. Ubi shemakdim lehitpalel b'shiur shemosifim michol al hakodesh harei ze zariz v'niskar. But there is a mitzvah to add to the to Yom Tov. So basically, this minhag of waiting till Tzedek Kochavim to start your arvit comes at the expense of doing a din which is d'Rabbanan and might even be d'Oraita to add to the Chag, and that's why we light our candles earlier, and that in general, and that's why we accept Shabbat a few minutes earlier than before Shkiyat Chama. So now, by pushing off Arvit, so you are in effect undermining that larger concept. So if he says, if you're going to want to follow the minhag, so then ikarak pedal aman dechashlo hu shelo leachol kodem halayla. So if you're going to be concerned about it, so then the that should be only doing it, not eating before the night begins, but certainly not a question of waiting with your tefillah until after Tzeit HaKochavim. Now, by the way that he phrases it, it sounds by saying mi laman dechashlo. Just want to pick up on that term, laman dechashlo. So that is basically saying the that we're referring to a minhag which some people keep, and if you're going to keep it, this is when you should keep it, only for the meal and not for the arvit. But it implies that most people in the German communities are going about their business and treating Shavuot the way that they would treat the Shabbat before. I didn't look at the Luach, but right now, roughly speaking, if our Shkia is around 7:40, Shkia in Germany right now is well after 8:30. So we're talking about a situation where by telling people they have to wait till Tzedek Kochavim, it means that they already have to wait to start their arvit until after 9 o'clock. So this is very burdensome on people. So again, around here, it's not such a big deal, but in northern communities, it is a very problematic type of minhag. So he's saying, even if you're going to be makbid, so wait to start your meal later, but daven arvit earlier. The Korban Netanel, who is a commentary, perhaps one of the major commentaries on the Rosh, and he's living at the same time, as you can see, is he's just 10 years older than Rav Yaakov Emden. Also, Rav Tanel Weil, also living in Germany. So he says the following: Mikan Raya. So he brings a diuk from the of the Rush. I didn't bring it because of the time, but basically the Rush says that the only time that we should not make an early Yom Tov, the only time is on Pesach. but on all other Shabbatot and Yomim Tovim, there isn't a problem in terms of eating earlier. So the Rama, the Korban Netanel says you can understand from this Rash, it's a proof against the Minhag. The Belel Shavuot ein mekadshin al hayayin ad tzedek kochavim dichtiv timimot tiyen. So this is a proof against the position of Magen Avraham. I didn't bring the Magen Avraham here. He also, same area of Poland, and he is bringing the Minhag as well as the Taz does, right? So somebody asked what happens in Edinburgh. They probably don't start Shavuot till the following morning. In any event, when it comes to the Tzedek Kochavim, so it's a whereas Rabbi Yaakov Emden couched it a little bit, saying a person who wants to be makbid should do so with regard to kiddush. The Korban Netanel says no. This is our minhag. Our minhag has always been to make Shabbat early, make in the summer. It's always been our minhag to make Yom Tov early, and that's what you should continue to do, with the exception of Pesach. And we don't have to worry about what the Austjuden are doing in Poland. That's basically the approach of the Korban Netanel. Now, as I said, you can see, okay, there's a pushback against the Minhag. The Minhag is developing. There's now a strong center of Judaism in Poland, and one might argue that already by the 18th century, when Rabbi Yaakov Emden and the Korban Netanel are operating, so the focus, the stronger community is already in Poland and not in Germany. There's a push against this in the German communities to retain their minhag. We're going to see later, which we only have about 20 minutes left, so there isn't not going to be that much later, that you can look at this as well, that the Hungarian communities also had problems with this. But before we get to that, I want to take a look and shift a little bit out of the minhag area and go into the question of the Lomdus in terms of trying to understand what could be the underpinnings, the analytic underpinnings of this particular machloket. The question is the following: Tosefet of Yom Tov, Tosefet of Shabbat. How do we view the Tosefet of Shabbat? And there are two and perhaps three different ways of understanding this. So let's take a look at a Tosfot where this machloket comes up. The Mishnah, in the first Mishnah in Psachim that many of you are familiar with, the Mishnah says, Erev Psachim Samuch Lemincha, source number 9, Lo Yochal Adam Ad Shetechshav. So on Erev Pesach, when it's near the time of Mincha, approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, a person should not engage in a meal until it is dark. And the question that arises is, why does the Mishnah have to say Ad Shetechshach? Because the primary focus of the Mishnah is that you're not supposed to eat on Erev Pesach, because you're supposed to have an appetite for the matzah and for the Pesach, what you're going to be eating in Leil HaSeder. And that's why you should stop eating anything, certainly anything heavy, after in the later half of the afternoon on Erev Pesach. Why does the Mishnah have to say that you can't eat Ad Shetechshach until it is dark? Because Tosfot asks, and Tosfot here we're talking about now the early 13th century, when the sort based on the people who are going to be quoted. The Tosfot asks, Makshidan amai itzrach Ad Shetechshach. Why do we have to say until it's dark? Pshita, this is obvious, because the Gemara Tosfot quotes compares it to other Shabbatot and Yom Tovim. The assumption is, why is it so simple? Is because on every Shabbat and Yom Tov, you're supposed to start your meal at dark. And so why should you be concerned about this? So the Tosfot says, Omer Harimi Korvil. So Rabbi Yitzchak Korvil says the Gabe Matzah, so he's in the in the 13th century. He says, "Gabe matzah dafka be'inan ad shetech." It's only when we're talking about Leila Seder are we concerned with ad shetech shach, that you're supposed to eat it when it's dark. Keditanya b'tosefta, etc. It quotes aval to the bold print. Sudat Shabbat v'yamim tovim matzi achil mi ba'od yom. So there's no problem, and this is basically the Minhag that we're all familiar with. There's no problem to be eating our Yom Tov and Shabbat meals while it's still day. And he quotes that same Gemara that the Pri Megadim 400 years later would reference, that a person can eat mitpalel adam. So here he talks about the first half. Mitpalel adam shel Shabbat be'erev Shabbat. You can pray, Tfilat Arvit of Shabbat on Friday. V'omer kiddush hayom mi ba'od yom. So there's a second part of the Gemara that you're allowed to say kiddush while it's still day as well. Now the Gemara never says that you're allowed to eat your meal, and there's some people who say that you can't eat your meal, as we're going to see in a moment. But you can make the kiddush and then wait. And the kiddush is also the kiddush, of course, is the kiddush of what you said in in Arvit. So basically, the idea is you can say Mekadesh Shabbat, and he's understanding that if you're saying Mekadesh Shabbat and you can make Kiddush Hayom, then you should make Kiddush Hayom al Hakos as well. And once you're making Kiddush with your wine, so then Ein Kiddush al Makom Suda, there's no Kiddush without a meal. So the meal begins when you made Kiddush. However, he quoted the Tosfot, that was one opinion of the Rishonim. Tosfot quotes Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbeinu Yehuda. I believe, I'm not 100% sure, that this is an earlier Rabbeinu Yehuda Ser Leon, who was about 40 or 50 years or so before the Rimi Corville. However, he says, Tiretz afilu iba inan gabe Shabbatot b'yamim tovim ad shetechshach. That even if there's a reason here why it's saying is that you don't have a proof that people can eat their meals beforehand, because even if you have throughout the year you can only have your meal once it's dark. When it comes to Pesach, the Mishnah has to say it explicitly ad shetechshach. Why? Because it's similar to what I had said earlier in terms of explaining Rashi and Tzmimot for Shavuot, is that since so much of the Pesach, of the Seder is focused on the Korban Pesach, and the Korban Pesach, Shchitat Psachim mi ba'od yom, eino ne'achal mi ba'od yom. I could have said, well, since the Korban Pesach has been slaughtered on during the day, on Erev Pesach, so I will now do, there we go. So similarly, I could eat my Seder meal, while it's still daytime. So the Mishnah has to say, no, that's not the halacha. The eating of the Korban Pesach, the eating of the matzah, has to take place at night. But on all other chagim, you also should not eat until it's dark. And he quotes a Yerushalmi along these lines, V'chein yesh b'Yerushalmi, that the Yerushalmi says, Lo yitom klum, the last lines of the Tosfos, Lo yitom klum ad shetechshach, that you shouldn't be eating anything until it's dark on all Shabbatot. Whereas our idea of starting the meal early, according to the Yerushalmi, doesn't work. And apparently, Rabbeinu Yehuda felt that, and it seems that there was this machloka between different Baalei Tosafot as to when you could start your meal. Do you have to start the meal after dark, or can you start the meal when the sun is still shining, when it's still Friday? What's the machloket? So the machloket, if you will, in Lomdus terms, is what is going on when I accept Shabbat. The halacha is that I can accept Shabbat, but what am I doing when I accept Shabbat? Am I able to change kedusha? Is that really within my purview? Is that within the purview of man? God has determined that Shabbat begins with the sun setting. God is Mekadesh Shabbat. God is Mekadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim. So how could I talk about the sanctity of the Sabbath when it is still Friday? I can't talk about that. What can I do, according to the Rabbeinu Yehuda and those who, perhaps the Yerushalmi? What I can do is I can limit myself. I can accept, or the community can accept upon itself, the Isur Malacha. The community can say, okay, we are going to treat it as Shabbat, but it's not really Shabbat yet. The Kedusha, the true sanctity of Shabbat, is going to only occur with the sun setting and with the stars coming out, and that is when I can eat my meal. But before then, I can daven, I can say Mikadesh Shabbat, because what I'm going to be doing with that sanctity is preventing myself from doing malacha, and I can go home and get things ready for the meal, which will begin as soon as Shabbat really starts. That's the way opinion number one, which is brought second here in the Tosfot, the Rabbeinu Yehuda understands it. What the Rabbi Korvil is saying, and perhaps this is what we are doing when we say Kiddush early and we eat our meals early, is that what is actually going on is that we have the right, that's the Kiddush of the Halacha, that we can, because of this din of Tosefet Shabbat, we can actually extend Shabbat into Friday. And when Shabbat, when I accepted Shabbat, it's now really Shabbat. It's not Friday with Isur Malacha. It is Shabbat itself. It's Shabbat proper. This is exactly the Chakira. This is exactly the question that the Nitziv dealt with this story of this unfortunate woman who had begun her Shiva after she had lit candles. And he says that he's not totally clear. He left it it's interesting that he says he signs it Yedido ha'amus ba'avodah rabbah. But in any event, what he says is that this is really the determining factor. The question is, when she accepted the Shabbat, she accepted Yom Tov. It was Shabbat and Yom Tov together that year. So when she accepted that dual Kedusha, what did she do when she lit her candles? Did she, in effect, accept Rabbeinu Yehuda's type of Tosefet Shabbat, that is Asur Malacha, but the motif and the basic nature of the day had not yet begun, and since it was not yet Yom Tov in its fullest sense, so then she could begin her Avelut. The whole reason why you can't begin Avelut isn't because you can't do Malacha now. The reason that you can't have Avelut is because there is the Simcha, the joy of Yom Tov, which is preventing your personal mourning from beginning. But if the personal mourning, if the joy hasn't begun yet, so then the mourning can begin. And then she would have had her Shiva, or truncated, by when Yom Tov began, and she wouldn't have Shiva at all. But on the other hand, if you say that her lighting of the candle along the lines of the Rimi Korvil, that, well, you can, if her husband came home from shul at that moment and they made Kiddush and they had the meal and then they got the word that it was still daylight. If they had made an early Yom Tov, and they get the word that the telegram came at that point. So then the Simcha of Yom Tov had begun. And so if I say that Hadlakat Neirot begins the Simcha of Yom Tov, so then there's nothing that she's going to be able to do. This type of question comes up, but we'll take it one step further. What the Taz is saying and the Shla is saying might be, if you're one step further, we could say that there's the issue here of the date, of the Isser Malacha. You can say there's the question of the extending the Kedusha into Friday or extending the Kedusha into Erev Yom Tov. But what the Taz is saying by saying, or this Minhag is saying, is that it's no longer the date of the 49th. it is now the 50th day, and therefore I have Tmimot. So am I able, can I go that far? Whereas I could accept the Rimi Corville, and presumably that's what they were doing in Germany. And you say, well, how can you be doing this? After all, it says Tmimot. So the response might be, well, who says that the date has changed? It's the 49th with the Kedusha of Shabbat, with the Kedusha of Shavuot. But it's still the 49th day. People can do a lot of things. There can be legal fictions, halachic legal fictions, and to say that the Kedusha of Shabbat has now been extended into the day before. But we can't change the sun. The sun hasn't set, so that means that the day itself, the date, is still the 49th. Now, this issue comes up in areas of halacha. Now, there's a fascinating machloket, which unfortunately I don't have time to read inside with you, but the machloket, and it works within the same type of context. The Taz is one of the disputants in this machloket. Can I make an early Shmini Atzeret? Let's say I were to be, it's Shmini Atzeret, and I want to have my Yom Tov meal a little bit earlier. I want to start davening a little earlier, and I accept Shmini Atzeret early. The problem is that Shmini Atzeret before it's not just Erev Shmini Atzeret, it's also Hoshana Rabbah. And there's a difference now as to what will occur if I have accepted Shmini Atzeret. On Shmini Atzeret, I'm not allowed to eat in the sukkah. But on Hoshana Rabbah, I have to eat in the sukkah. So what am I supposed to do if I made an early Shmini Atzeret? I can't eat in the sukkah because it's usher to eat in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeret. But on the other hand, on Shmini Atzeret, but on the other hand, I have to eat in the sukkah because maybe it's Hoshana Rabbah with the Kedusha of Shmini Atzeret. So what am I supposed to do? So here it turns into a machloket between an earlier Polish posek, the Rav Shlomo Luria, the Marshal, and this is again perhaps. We don't know what the Marshal's position with regard to this particular minhag was. At least I'm not familiar with him being on the record about it. But he says that with regard to Shmini Atzeret, so therefore you're not allowed to eat. If you accepted Shmini Atzeret earlier, you can't eat because you can't eat in the sukkah and make kiddush of Shmini Atzeret on the one hand. Even in Chutz La'aretz, you're not supposed to. You would have to make the bracha of Leishei Basukah on Hoshana Rabbah, and you can't do that if you're making kiddush of Shmini Atzeret. And on the other hand, right, you can't be outside of the sukkah, so you're stuck. The Taz, on the other hand, that same Taz who was pushing our minhag that we're talking about and saying that you're not even supposed to daven Arvit earlier. So he is he's consistent, and he says after colorfully rejecting the Marshal, which we won't read right now, he says u'be'emet svara shebana harav alav eino kiyum klal devadai mi shemosif mechol ala kodesh hu oseh al pi tzivui toratenu kfar chalaf v'halach mimenu chovat hayam mashahaya alov kodem zeh v'havei kemo balayla u'machar mamash. So he says a very interesting chidush, and I think this is taking the position of extending the kedusha one step further. He's saying that when I accept Shmini Atzeret, it is now no longer Sukkot. It is now Shmini Atzeret. Shmini Atzeret has now just received an extra hour, and Sukkot has lost an hour. So there is absolutely no problem, according to the Taz, to go into my sukkah, not to go into my sukkah, go into my dining room, to make kiddush, to say the bracha of Mekadesh Yisrael v'Azmanim with regard to Biyom Shmini Chag HaTzeret Hazeh. And even though my neighbor is having his Preda Min HaSukkah at the same time, because for me it is Shmini Atzeret, for him, it's still Sukkot. That is the position of the Taz. What I've done is not only extend the Kedusha of Shmini Atzeret into Sukkot, which might be what the Marshal would say, because there's no indication that he wouldn't accept Shabbat earlier as well and have those meals. You can have the Kedusha, that's fine. But what you can't do is change the date. You can't change Sukkot into Shmini Atzeret. You can't do that. So therefore, if you can't eat until the sun sets, whereas according to the Taz, we have that power to actually change the date before. If I change the date before, so then, in effect, I've taken back to Shavuot, I've taken some of the Sfirat HaOmer away. I've taken some of the Sfirat HaOmer away. It's no longer a full 49 days. I can no longer say Tmimot Tihiyena. And if I can't say Tmimot Tihiyena, so then I will have a problem, and that's the, if you will, the analytic underpinning for a minhag which has developed in the 16th century in terms of understanding it. And this is the way that the later Achronim understood the Taz. So you could therefore argue with this from one of two perspectives. Either you can accept not argue. You can, if you do not accept the minhag, and there were those who didn't accept the minhag, as we've seen in Germany, and there were later authorities as well who felt that the mitzvah of extending Shabbat and Chag took precedence over this idea of Tmimot. So then you can say, well, it really depends on how I understand the notion of Tosefet Shabbat. If I understand the notion of Tosefet Shabbat and Yom Tov as being that I'm changing the calendar date as well, that would lead me to the position of the Taz. If, on the other hand, I say that it is extending the Kedusha, or perhaps only the Isur Malacha, certainly, so then I don't have to accept the Taz. And that would perhaps be the underpinning of the German pushback against this minhag of not starting Shavuot early. I'm going to just, since we started at 5 minutes late, I'm just going to take those last 3 minutes to see what's going on here as well, because you could argue, even if you were to say that you are taking it and you are cutting off a bit of the Sfira, there's a second element, the element of Tmimot. Is that really not a complete day? And here, this is what I said seems to be a stream in Hungarian Jewry, which pushed against this minhag as well. Not only the Germans pushing against the minhag, but this is later on in the 19th century, that this is occurring, and it's no one less than the Chatam Sofer. The Chatam Sofer, in his Perush to the Torah, so he says, when do you have Tmimot? If you really care about Tmimot, when do you have it? This year. Eimat, when does this occur? Kishechal Atzeret Achar Shabbat. Only in a situation where Shavuot falls out after Shabbat, because now you can't even light your candles earlier. You can't be in shul earlier. And he continues, I don't have the time to read it inside, because at any other time, you're going to have a little bit of the, at the beginning of Sfira, you're not going to have a complete count either, because after all, Sfira begins after the first day of Pesach as well. We made Havdalah, all of us made Havdalah into the first day of Chol HaMoed. We didn't do it exactly when Chol HaMoed began, because we accepted more of Yom Tov, and before we made, and this year Shabbat, before we made our Havdalah, before we counted Sfirat HaOmer. So you don't have Tmimot on that end. You don't really have Tmimot on this end, and it doesn't really bother us. It doesn't bother us. If you really want, he's basically saying, if you really want pure Tmimot, you'll only have Tmimot when Shavuot falls on Motzei Shabbat, and you can begin and we will begin Be'ezrat Hashem our Shavuot after Tzeit HaKochavim, after Shabbat is over. So that's on one level. His grandson, in a tshuva, and it's a much lengthier tshuva. I just took a summary of it. That is brought. His grandson, Rav Moshe Sofer, who was murdered in the Shoah at a very elderly age, as you can see. But he, in his position, he says the following. He says, if you're I'm not going to read it inside, but if you're concerned about Tmimot, so if you felt along the lines of the Taz that the day has now begun, let's say in the Shmini Atzeret din, Shmini Atzeret has now begun, even though it's an hour before sunset on the seventh day of Sukkot. It's no longer Sukkot. It's now Shmini Atzeret. But there is no problem then of saying that Tmimot. Who says Tmimot have to be a 24-hour period? Basically, the 49th day has now finished when I accepted Shavuot. And I had a full 49 days. It's just that one of those 49 days had 23 hours. But the notion of Tmimot, the full 49-day period, is still there. So even if you accept the Taz's Chiddush, that the idea that you can now say that part of I've extended the date into the previous day, even if I accept that notion, who says that that's now not good, that is no longer Tmimot? So you see a pushback, as again, that you have different communities, and on the one hand, you could look at it from if you will, the sociology of Minhagim, where a Minhag begins in a certain area in Galicia, and its neighboring communities, be it in Germany, be it in the south in Hungary, are less excited about changing long-standing practices. But you can also look at it from the perspective of the Lomdus, perspective of the Bet Midrash, in terms of understanding a core concept of Tosefet Shabbat, Tosefet Yom Tov. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there are three different ways of looking at that. Do I say that when I accept Shabbat early, all I have the power to do is to forbid myself or forbid the community from doing melacha, but I don't have the power to accept the kedusha? That's the position of the Yerushalmi. The position of most of the Rishonim and their understanding of the Bavli and the common practice is to allow for kiddush, to allow for the meal, which means that I can extend the kedusha of Shabbat into Friday, and the later chiddush of the Taz and those who are accepting that notion of the minhag of not saying Arvit of Shavuot until after the final day, after Tzeit HaKochavim, that is basically saying that when I accept Tosefet Shabbat, I'm actually able to change the calendar date as well. And therefore, it could have an undermining of the notion of Tmimot, but at least as the Stam Sofer and his family felt, not necessarily so. Tmimot can perhaps still exist, even if it is, in terms of the time scale, is somewhat truncated. Whatever, this year, according to all opinions, we'll be having Tmimot. We should all have a Chag Matan Toratenu, which is Sameach. And with that, I will finish the share.